competitive advantage for UK aerospace through a world-leading collaborative network. The Hydrogen Capability Network will progress a number of recommendations from the ATI's Fly Zero project, putting in place the key enablers to the development of hydrogen-related aerospace technologies in the UK, particularly the test infrastructure, skills requirements, and access to liquid hydrogen that the sector needs for its test and development activities. With other nations moving quickly, the UK must act to ensure that we have a strategic and coordinated approach to this emerging market. I'm therefore delighted by the progress that's being made under Phase 0 of the Hydrogen Capability Network activity, and I'd like to hand over to Programme Director Laura Cuss to tell you more.
Thank you, Harry. So as per the introduction there from Harry, I'm Laura Cuss. I'm the Programme Director for the Hydrogen Capability Network, which we kicked off in April this year. So thank you everyone for joining us. Just a little bit on some of the, the ways of running the webinar. So we are, as you can see, the agenda is showing now, but from the perspective of the webinar itself. So you should be all on mute and you'll have all the cameras off. But as we go through the slides, do feel free to use either the Q&A functionality or the chat functionality. Drop your questions in there. It'd be really great if you're happy to sort of put your name after your question and perhaps in brackets the organisation that you're from, just so we can understand perhaps the context of some of the question, and we'll do the best to answer them at the end. So Nor will facilitate those questions at the end for us. So with regards to the agenda, what we're going to do is sort of just take you through a little bit of a reminder of what the Hydrogen Capability Network is and what the Phase 0 project. And then at this point, where we're around 8 months in, we'll take you through some of the priority interventions that we are putting forward and proposing as a result of our engagement across the aerospace sector. We'll hopefully then sort of wrap those up then into conclusions to sort of explain where we are and what our immediate next steps are, and then we'll go into answering the questions that hopefully you've put in that chat. So if you can jump to the next slide, please, Nor. Okay, so the Hydrogen Capability Network. As Harry sort of indicated, as a result of the Fly Zero project, which the ATI ran, there was a number of recommendations that were made. Some of those recommendations we've been delighted have been coming through the ATI programme as technology programmes. We can see there's a lot of appetite and demand and sort of vision within the sector to drive forward the future for zero carbon aerospace, and taking board that largely that will be around hydrogen and specifically liquid hydrogen. However, as a result of a number of those programmes, we've seen some areas where some further coordination is required, and driving that coordinated effort is what the purpose of the Hydrogen Capability Network was. So fundamentally, we need to make sure we've got a liquid hydrogen supply to enable the R&D in the sector. Whilst there are a lot of demands that sort of articulate what the volumes of liquid hydrogen required are, it's very much around sort of the offtake and the end use, and there was never a coordinated demand signal for the R&D. And as it's everyone's sort of aware, if we can't get the right volumes of liquid hydrogen supply to enable R&D, that will impact the future of the sector in the UK. There's coordination required around the skills and the research. So we've focused very much from the Hydrogen Capability Network perspective on sort of the cryogenic side and the liquid hydrogen side. And I think it's safe to say sort of when it comes to cryogenic skills, whilst there's some that exists in other sectors, there is generally a global shortage of those skills for cryogenics. There are more in the US, but certainly across the UK as well, there's a limited number of people. So we need to grow that skills base, and we need to work out, sort of how we enable those skills both in the research community, right down through to sort of the technicians and apprentices that are going to be fundamental part of enabling the R&D in the sector. Again, within the research areas, we still feel that there is some research that needs to be advanced at the lower TRLs to enable some of those technology programs that I alluded to earlier. So there's more to be done there. And then finally, with regards to test infrastructure and demonstration, how do we make sure we don't have too much duplication across the sector, but that we do enable sort of open access test network and access to those facilities that are underpinned fundamentally by supply of liquid hydrogen. So that are our core activities, and you can see, you know, the reason that we're doing that. If I jump on to the next slide, what we talk about then is the phase zero. So sponsored by the Department for Business and Trade, we set up the 12-month phase zero project. And largely what we're really trying to answer is, what does the sector need and what does that hydrogen capability network look like in the future? So, you know, there's a number of deliverables, and what I really want to take you through at the moment is, by listening to those requirements from the engagement in the sector, what we're seeing some of those interventions for our next phase looking like. And jump onto the next slide. It kind of highlights to us what we're showing here is how we've gone about that first 12 months. So we set up a 12 months program, and we've engaged across the sector through and hopefully with a number of you that are on this call, through a series of methods. So we set out questionnaires. We've had a number of workshops. We are fortunate enough within the team, so whilst a small team, we've got some industry secondees from Airbus, Rolls-Royce, Health and Safety Executive, HVMC and the National Physical Laboratory. So that kind of help brings in some of that input, not just from the companies that they represent, but from the networks that they themselves bring. And we've done a lot of engagement across the numbers of cross-sector and other sort of hydrogen initiatives to make sure that we're aligned in our thinking, and, you know, making sure that whilst we are trying to be a voice for liquid hydrogen and cryogenics in aerospace, that we are considering the coherence with cross-sector wider hydrogen initiatives, and those for aerospace. So the first 6 months was around the gathering of the requirements and scoping the interventions. Now we're in the next 3 months, which this is part of, which is about socialising some of those solutions and starting to bring that together to articulate what the operating model is for a hydrogen capability network and develop that into a series of business cases to put into government. What I would sort of say is, what the hydrogen capability and network is about is exactly as the name suggests. We do feel that to deliver it, it is a network of delivery partners or an alliance of delivery partners. So this isn't about creating something sort of, you know, a new big initiative in the sector that duplicates things that's out there. Is how do we bring together things that exist in the most coherent way and coordinated way, and essentially be a little bit of that glue for hydrogen in aerospace to drive a number of these action points forward. We'll go in then to the final 3 months, hopefully then to sort of start pushing the business case forward. What we are conscious of, as I'm sure everyone is, there is a little bit of an uncertain political landscape at the moment. So, you know, there is likely to be over the next 12 months, the general election and the following CSR. So what we're trying to make sure is that we seed the right interventions in the next 12 months to make sure things are happening, from listening to the priorities, what we've heard across the sector, to make some of those things happen, but then keeping an eye onto a follow-on comprehensive spending review, which hopefully leads, you know, to the bigger part of phase 1 and phase 2 to drive forward the coordination that is required. So I'm going to jump on to the next slide, which will then just sort of give a framework of the context of what the opportunity is and why we're doing this. So what we really want to do is, on behalf of the UK, increase the visibility of action in our hydrogen and for aerospace to position ourselves against some of our European and global counterparts. We want to make sure we have a focused network team that's taking forward some of the priorities around the core research and making sure we've got, you know, that demand signal and supply of liquid hydrogen, because bringing some of that together then underpins the whole technology development that is required for the sector. There's a little bit which you'll see on the next slide. So what what we're quite aware of from what we've learned so far is that this is a new era really from aerospace. We can't take for granted how these aircraft operate around the aviation and airport landscape. So we need to try and bring together aerospace and aviation for demonstration. We have to think about how we refuel, defuel and handle the hydrogen around the aircraft and in the airport environment. So we think it's important as we look towards the future that we bring together those demonstration points and widen the focus from just the aerospace perspective. And why do we want to do this as well? How do we increase the opportunities for the supply chain in the UK? So that can be from looking at some of the cross-sector areas around cryogenic components, but also through the interventions that we're proposing. How do we increase sort of the open access facility and access to the data that's going to enable some of that innovation? And then fundamentally from all those interventions, how do we accelerate sort of the UK's hydrogen skills, expertise and capability? Okay. So a test pyramid, and fundamentally this is where we have been thinking around how our sort of interventions enable us in the UK to move up that test pyramid. So, you know, we're very much at the bottom bits at the moment, and you can see on the right there we give an indication of sort of how the scope of our phases changes sort of over time to align to these. You'll hear today that we talk about interventions 1 to 5. And interventions 1 to 5 for us are the critical and priority things that have to kick off in phase 1. Things we have to start seed funding as soon as possible to start getting the progress and cementing some of that critical work within the UK. So at the very base there is making sure we've got the liquid hydrogen supply for R&D, and we'll cover a little bit more of that for you later. At the bottom of the pyramid, then there's a little bit here around the development of the fundamentals, and that sits closely with the research strand. So, you know, what is some of the fundamental science and research that needs to be advanced? And one of those which we heard very strongly as a voice sort of across the sector at the beginning was we need sort of a standardized approach to materials testing. So what are our methods and what are our standardized processes? So as we progress through the R&D around the products, that we can move to certification, knowing we've got a common baseline of how the materials were used and tested. We want the UK to be a leader in that space and also have that voice then sort of into European and global positions as we move ultimately then to international standards. Moving up the test pyramid, it's about how we can actually test some of the components and subsystems as they work through sort of the design and development, and liquid hydrogen being what it is, it's how do we find the right number of hubs in the right locations for that testing. Liquid hydrogen, you know, sort of being what it is, you have to, in, you know, these sort of environments, take the testing to the liquid hydrogen rather than the other way around. So how do we make sure we've got the right capacity of testing to service the UK's needs, and how do we ensure, as well as the testing happening, do we, you know, understand more about the health and safety and the operation of the hydrogen in conjunction with that, and advance some of our research? And as we've said, then skills and training sits across sort of the whole test pyramid, but we still have to start at the moment with seeding some funding for skills and coordinating an effort around sort of our research community. As you move up then into the other phases, I guess the amount of testing grows in scale. So how do we get then to integrated ground testing? How do we bring that together with the aviation interface I talked about as being quite important? And then ultimately you move up from flight demonstration potentially into sort of industrialization and certification facilities. Okay, so that was sort of a high-level view of how we're approaching across the test pyramid. I'm going to hand over now to Helen, who will give you a bit more details about what we're calling Intervention 1 and the research landscape.
Thank you, Laura. So if you look at Fly Zero, there's a lot of recommendations came out about the topics that need funding and developing to deliver hydrogen-powered flight. They range from general, not hydrogen specific, so things like aircraft modelling, high rate manufacture, all those sorts of topics, through to ones that are more hydrogen specific. So how you actually burn hydrogen in a gas turbine, how you power and set up a fuel cell suitable for flight, how you deal with the fact that the wings and aircraft will now be dry and the tanks will be sitting within the fuselage. And you've then got some that are very specific, such as the actual fuel storage, its delivery system, its pressurization, and its thermal management as it goes between the tank and the power source, whatever that is. You can see the landscape we've got drawn here. You've got some topics are well known, well established within the aerospace field. So if you consider things like modelling, high rate manufacture, design of aircraft, design of combustion, they're all well established, and there's really strong research communities, both at mid-TRL within the primes and also within the research community within the UK. It's not to say the challenge of delivering hydrogen-powered combustion within a gas turbine is not big. It is quite challenging and will require a lot of work and a lot of focus, but the UK does have quite a strength in this area and within the aerospace and flight and delivering aerodynamic design. If you consider, however, the fuel system, the whole cryogenic storage, the management of cryogenic fuel as it transitions between 20 Kelvin through to the order of 300 Kelvin at the point of use in a power source, and up to about 50, 60, maybe even more bar for a gas turbine. The management of that fuel system, of the fuel, its state, and how you actually design all of that system is disruptive technology. It's something that's not known to the primes. It's completely new. And it's an area that the UK doesn't have a great deal of strength in at this stage. Considering the fuel system work, a lot of the primes have kicked off what I would call mid-TRL research, looking at fuel system design, but really more at the engineering side of things. So how do they actually have a go and learn and get experience in designing that? What is missing in the current landscape, the low TRL scientific research to underpin that, the understanding of how hydrogen behaves as a liquid, how its state changes, particularly around its critical point. Those aspects the UK has much less strength in, particularly for application to aerospace, and there's not really an aerospace community driving those research. And we've had a very clear signal from industry and from academia that were we to stick with the status quo, that research would not keep pace with what's needed for the technology development. So there's been a really clear steer from all our stakeholders that we need to have an intervention and to boost and have an acceleration of the research in that field. So we're going to focus primarily in this next year coming up, and the next 6 months in particular, on pulling together research proposals to tackle those areas. And that will then drive a rapid flow of technology from the low TRL through to the mid TRL to support those existing fuel system design projects that are already in train and being funded by the ATI. Key to this, as I've mentioned, the primes and the tier one supply chain are very active in this field already. The supply chain supporting them needs their knowledge boosting so they can design suitable components to feed into that whole design system. And this low TRL pre-competitive research that we're proposing will support that knowledge transfer into the supply chain and enable them to support the primes in developing the technology. As mentioned, a very strong link through to skills development. There's a lot of learning by doing in this space. This technology is not known to the aerospace, and we need to learn by doing. By then funding and driving the research in this area would also in parallel drive the skills. And we've had a lot of feedback from our stakeholders that how we certify a liquid hydrogen power aircraft is not clear. And so we need to link with our certification authorities to ensure that they have the knowledge and the understanding of the critical questions to be asking going forwards to certify liquid hydrogen powered flight. As Laura mentioned, one of the key topics, and we're much more mature in this, is on the actual generation of materials properties for cryogenic space, and that's our intervention 2. And I'd like to hand over to Stefanos at this stage.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much. So yeah, following extensive engagement across the wider aerospace sector, materials testing and standards together were highlighting as a very critical area. So over the last 3 months, the HCN team has been working very closely with several key industry stakeholders to define a focused, coordinated program of work aiming to address key priorities for enabling materials. So what you see in this slide is a description of the high-level activities of the program over a period of 4 years and the anticipated yearly outputs. This initial scope focuses on mechanical, thermal, and physical measurements and is looking to build confidence in testing at temperatures as low as 20 Kelvin, while in parallel developing the capability to perform these tests within a liquid hydrogen environment. It is anticipated that validated test methods will be available at the end of the program to support industry needs, and standardization process will be well underway. So we have full details of the materials testing intervention, and we're discussing these in a recording available on YouTube and presentation available on the ATI website. You're going to have links to all these in the chart very shortly. The team at the moment is seeking for feedback to map the existing and planned test infrastructure, while at the same time engaging with potential partners to start delivering this program of work as soon as possible. The signals we have is that this is very important to enable aerospace companies to progress further with their technology development. I will now hand over to my colleague Ryan Green, who will talk through our work on testing infrastructure at small and medium scale.
Thanks, Stepanos. Hello, everyone. So as part of the efforts to try and understand what the UK might do in future phases of this thing we're calling the Hydrogen Capability Network, one of the core activities was to really try and understand what test capability there was out there. Focus predominantly on how we support our tier ones, SMEs and primes on building the necessary skills and products to give us a solid future in the sort of hydrogen space from an aerospace perspective. So the following is validated by our network, so by a lot of you probably on this call, and I hope it makes some sense. So what have we found out? It's two core messages really. The first one is that there is a good amount, an amazing amount of very driven people, organizations who are really trying to ramp up the test capability of hydrogen because of health and safety concerns, because of funding availability, because of where we are in the sort of TRL journey. Much of that capability is based around gaseous hydrogen testing or limiting liquid hydrogen cryogenic testing to very small volumes. And there are over 30 facilities around the UK and more being discussed and supported every day that really get that baseline capability up and running. Is it as coordinated as we might want it to be? Probably not. But I think it's a good thing just to focus on some positives and just to say that there's an incredible amount of work out there that's really trying to get their hands dirty with hydrogen. The second thing we learn is really that when we start looking at aerospace technologies, especially those that require either high volumes or high flow rates of liquid hydrogen to test the product, to certify that product, ultimately to pass off that product, there really is no facilities here in the UK today that can do that. So when we look across the world, you know, there's famous facilities with NASA. There's some organizations in Germany and the Netherlands that are probably ahead of the UK in supporting and developing these larger infrastructure pieces for liquid hydrogen. And the intervention we're describing here is to propose to the UK government and other funding organizations that we really should invest in some large scale, we're calling them hubs, that can test high volumes and high rates of liquid hydrogen. A lot of conversations are happening when you look at the organizations in the UK that have development projects either supported by ATI or privately funded. There are conversations ongoing to try and build this capability, but the message we hear from our network is it's not available quickly enough and it's probably not coordinated well enough to be effective. Laura mentioned it earlier. The other thing we look at in this intervention is how we do link these hubs, these 2 or 3 core assets that test higher volumes of liquid hydrogen, with the much bigger conversations that are happening across the UK. I've mentioned a couple of acronyms there, HI, ZEFI, there's about 10 others. And what they're looking at is the much bigger infrastructure piece on, how do we get the energy, how do we distribute that energy, how do we get green hydrogen, how do we distribute that hydrogen, and finally, how do we test these big hydrogen projects for all sectors, so not just for aerospace, but for maritime, for energy, for other sectors. So we're also very active to try and link what we're building here in the short term with that longer term vision of having, true cryogenic liquid hydrogen capability here in the UK. So what is the intervention? I've kept it very simple here. You're our network, so if you want any more details, please feel very free to contact us. In the very, very short term, it's to invest in the most credible sites that can test liquid hydrogen at scale to support all of the amazing companies that are planning to do so in the next 3 to 5 years. We recognise about 3 or 4 sites that could be capable of doing that, and our job now is to try and encourage investment on those sites, so that happens as quickly as possible. To be transparent, we're proposing formally at the moment 2 hubs, with the ZEDC, which is the facility that Airbus are building down in the southwest, and HSC, which is a destructive test capability in the Midlands, as the 2 preferred hubs, predominantly because they're first to market above all many other things. Something the ATI and the HCN wants to do as we move into future phases and make sure that the UK testing ambition from the companies that are doing testing is pushed towards these hubs, so that we really build that link between test capability and skills and upskilling. And importantly, we have to make sure that these investments occur in time. If we don't intervene here, the other strong signal we get from OEMs and tier ones is that this testing will go overseas and we lose that chance to build this capability here. So I think, to summarize quickly, we've reached a success point from a phase 0 perspective. We've done the work now to get an industry validated view of what is desirable from a testing infrastructure perspective, support this network of gaseous testing and low volume testing as much as we can, and intervene to build liquid hydrogen test capability. And I guess the next step is always the tricky one in these conversations is, can our industry, with support from the ATI, with support from the government, can we deliver on that ambition as we move through next year and onwards? Thanks for your time. I'll hand over to the next HCN member.
Thank you, Ryan. Hello, everybody. So as part of the HCN work, as Laura mentioned earlier, one of the areas we kind of focused on and looked at was actually the challenges around LH2 supply. And so during the Fly Zero period and after the Fly Zero period, we had some discussions with industry and we understood that there's a significant challenge on securing that supply. So some of the work that was done here really was collating what that demand signal looks like to understand, well, if there's a challenge on supply, what are those challenges and what sort of quantity of liquid hydrogen do we actually need? Now, this is a very, very early indication of those quantities. So the data has actually been updated quite recently, which is a little bit more than what we've got there. However, the pattern is very similar. The data has been collated by a number of questionnaires, which a lot of you probably have filled out and supported us on this. So about 200 questionnaires were sent out. We had 40 organizations that came back to us and said, well, we have a requirement for liquid hydrogen and we can help support HCN and kind of collating that demand to understand what that looks like and to understand what those sort of quantities of hydrogen are going to be used for, as from a technology development point of view. What are the challenges associated with, as in, some of the major sort of suppliers of liquid hydrogen today and the contractual agreements that need to be put in place to secure that. Liquid hydrogen is a big thing right now all across Europe. There's a number of sort of nations that are producing liquid hydrogen, a very small number of nations, and it's becoming quite a political and challenging to actually get a hold of liquid hydrogen. So what we've got here is a very early indication of what that demand signal looks like. As I've said, it's continuously updating. I'm in constant discussions with sort of organizations who are looking at doing testing and development of technology in the UK to understand what their development cycle is going to be looking like over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I would love to have a discussion with anybody who's on this call today to if they can contribute to that demand signal. And the purpose of this demand signal is to then go about understanding how can we support the sector, i.e. yourselves, on securing liquid hydrogen with government support, but also with the hubs that we're proposing, that Ryan proposed earlier on in this presentation. So one of the key things, a couple of key things we learned from collating this data, one was actually, if you look at this particular graph here, there's two lines very similar, and they are shifted slightly. And the reason for that is a lot of the sort of thought process around testing using liquid hydrogen didn't really take into consideration the challenges associated with liquid hydrogen regarding boil off, other losses, chill down of test facilities. So the values we've got here actually are uplifted slightly. The yellow sort of data there slightly uplifted to kind of take into consideration those types of losses that might occur during the whole process of delivery, usage and storage. In addition to that, this is kind of an early stage of that data. What we're looking at doing is trying to understand where that exact ramp up occurs and what kind of contributes to that ramp up. So what we've got here is, you'll see on the graph there, the really sharp ramp up, which is some early sort of gas turbine testing using liquid hydrogen, some initial pre-production testing of some technologies as well, and those are the critical steps you see there. The next phase of this is actually to take this data, go through the same process we've already gone through and really ensure we validate it, ensure that if that data has been changed slightly, which it has, because these are development programs that are continuously improving, continuously changing, so we want to make sure we've got the correct data. We've started conversations with a number of potential suppliers. That conversation has been ongoing for the last couple of months. We intend to continue those conversations to see how we can secure and support the tankering in of liquid hydrogen. But what we're also looking at doing is looking at potential production in the UK and having this vision and supporting the sector, along with guiding the UK government on actually investing in production in the UK. So we're looking at small scale production all the way up to significant production that could potentially be across sector. So that's our intentions in the next couple of months in part of the phase one, initially supporting that sort of tankering in, and also looking at the sort of costs associated with it and where there might be an opportunity and a requirement for cost stabilization and supporting what that cost per kilogram of hydrogen might look like, and then looking at implementing some more small scale production, localized LH2 production, potentially at the hubs, potentially at other locations where there are projects going around the UK for gaseous hydrogen, and then a long-term sort of hopefully supporting a national, what would be a national asset of production of liquid hydrogen in the UK to support multiple sectors. So that's the plan moving forward. I'd love to hear from everybody who's on the call today, what their thought process is on with regard to this, and whether they would be willing to have a discussion with me regarding their sort of hydrogen requirements moving forward, and we can kind of continuously update this demand signal and make sure we're supporting the sector to the best of our abilities and guiding the government in the right direction from an investment point of view. I'll hand it over to Helen now for intervention 5. Thank you.
Thank you. So the final intervention is looking at skills, and as Laura outlined earlier, skills underpin everything, right from early concept delivery, early understanding of the phenomena behind liquid hydrogen and what we need to design, right through to high rate manufacture once the product's available. So it's really important to look at the skills piece in this area. You may or may not be aware, but the hydrogen is obviously a key topic at the moment. So there are a lot of people looking at hydrogen skills at the moment out there. So why are we still concerned with it? Where does the HCN fit in with the story that's out there? So if you look, there are organisations such as the Hydrogen Skills Alliance, the Hydrogen Innovation Initiative, HYDEX, which is an East Midland organisation, and Hydrogen Southwest, all of which are looking at the skills piece with regards to hydrogen. But they're looking at the entire story, right from make it, move it, use it as the strapline they use. So right from hydrogen manufacture, how you store it, how you transport it around, to how you finally use it. And in the use case area, they're covering cross sectors. So not only aerospace, but also trains, cars, potentially boats, marine. So they're covering a very broad gamut of hydrogen skills. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the Aerospace Growth Partnership, who also have a skills agenda. Their focus, that has been driven by the Fly Zero skills report, is to look at what skills does the aerospace specifically need for hydrogen going forward, and we're working with them jointly to run skills workshops to identify those in a lot more detail. But that covers, as I outlined earlier with the research, the full range of topics associated with hydrogen. So that covers hydrogen specific skill set, but also the broader aerospace skill set, so manufacturing and those issues as well, high rate manufacture. So where then does HCN fit in with all of this? Now, the top stream, because of the use cases primarily being focused on gaseous, their skills will focus mainly on the hydrogen gaseous part of the story. And as I say, the AGP is covering the full aerospace. So we see a need to tackle in particular the skills associated with the understanding, design, manufacturing and handling of liquid hydrogen in all its state. And we're getting a very clear steer from our stakeholders that are struggling to recruit qualified or people with both aerospace and hydrogen experience in to carry out their current research topics, and it's actually inhibiting the development of the technology now. Going forwards, we want to look to build a community of people with this knowledge and use the research work that we're doing in Intervention 1 to build a community of early career researchers to share knowledge, to understand what's going on, bring them together, and to do PhD enrichment, to signpost to them that aerospace, particularly those who aren't funded by aerospace organisations or aerospace topics, that aerospace is a key area they could move into. Ryan alluded to the learning by doing that happens from the test hubs that we're planning. So we're planning again to work with local academic organisations to capture that learning and formalise that into training. And we're focusing all our efforts in ensuring that we fill that gap in terms of liquid hydrogen understanding going forward. We are already and will continue to support the work that the Hydrogen Skills Alliance is doing on the broad piece, and they will focus much more on formalising apprenticeships that will support and doing proper foresighting and forecasting in terms of the skill set. And as I say, we're already supporting the AGP in their delivery of the aerospace market going forwards. And we can see this as an intervention that will feed into, at some point in the future, a hydrogen academy that will cover cross sectors in the same way you have the electric revolution skills hub supporting the electric revolution story. So as I say, in the short term, or in the hydrogen capability network, is going to focus on delivery for the liquid hydrogen skills while supporting all the other initiatives that are happening around the patch. At that point, I hand back to Laura.
Thank you. So we're on slide 14, just in case anyone is having any abilities now where it is getting a little bit stuck. So really, it's just now for me to sort of summarise the sort of interventions 1 to 5 that you've heard about. And if we just click on, so what we're trying to do here with this slide is put a little bit of a summary around where the phase 1 is to enable the critical priorities, and phase 2 is really then about how do we move our ambition up a level where we can get to sort of the integrated ground test and moving into demonstration. So if you are able to flick on, so intervention 1 and 2, and when that box sort of just comes away, so it's about the research. And how do we make sure we pick up what those priority topics are, either at that fundamental science level or research which enables, which is enabling, I guess, against, progression of technology development up the TRLs. So intervention 1, Helen told you sort of about the broad approach, and intervention 2 is an example then of how we've pushed forward one of those priority topic areas as sort of a strategic research project, which is looking at driving something across the whole UK for aerospace in that sort of pre-competitive IP stage, but fundamentally it will enable across sort of the full levels of the TRL right up into making sure we've got the ability to develop products that can be certified. Interventions 3 and 4 then is very much around the hubs. So Ryan told you sort of about the 2 hubs that we're proposing, which we feel fits the capacity the planned capacity that is required in the UK to satisfy what we want to do as a sector to progress the research and development and our sort of test plan and test needs. And as Wasim sort of showed then, that's underpinned by the understanding of the aerospace R&D demand for that hub as we go through technology development. Clearly then as part of that, what we learn, and by having a hub that is run sort of closely with the health and safety executive, we're able to sort of advance the safety and standards and understanding as well around the operation of hydrogen. And I'll keep coming back to that's where it's important that we're thinking just broader than aerospace on this. And then finally, intervention 5, which Helen just took you through last, was about skills. So whilst that longer term solution is how do you have a cross-sector academy, very much that near term is we need to start doing some things now. We need the skills to sort of underpin some of this early test, this early research. So through the other interventions that we're suggesting across the HCN, how do we make sure we're pulling out the learning that's coming from the research that we sort of fund and enable, and how do we make sure that where we've got these test hubs, we've got that learning by doing ethos as well that comes back into formal skills programs. Then sort of into phase 2, so 1 to 5, as we said earlier, these are the things that we've heard are the priorities that we need to start doing now. Phase 2, which we're starting to scope now, but that will continue to be scoped if and when we progress beyond the phase 0, is really then starting to think about that larger scale test ambition, and where we think it's critical then to engage across the aviation sector, bringing in the CAA, bringing in the regulator and everything together. So yeah, that's it as a summary. I think, oh, sorry, yeah, one more slide, which is really about the timing. So where I was alluding to sort of phase 0 as our project, that continues to the end of March. And phase 1 for me is very much about, which I think I've mentioned, is let's seed the things that need to start happening across those interventions 1 to 5, where, and I think someone has alluded to it as a question in the chat, overseas funding is happening. The UK almost has to sort of set out its stall for and start funding things to show that we are serious and that we're able to sort of compete against some of these European programs, so we can give the confidence to the sector that the UK is there and will be there to support them. And then ultimately, as we move through phase 1 and starting to thinking about how we mobilize the future phases, how does that come in online in the right time to support the 2 different types of technology development we got here with the sort of a liquid hydrogen fuel cell type aircraft and a liquid hydrogen gas turbine aircraft, and making sure we have the right skills, the right research, the right facilities in place in time that they're required to sort of hold for the programs that the sector requires. And that's it for me. I think we're going to now go to the questions in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura, and thank you to everyone who's presented through all of the different interventions. Thanks for everyone for putting some questions in the chat. There's some really interesting topics. So we've got a bit of time, so I'm just going to go through them one by one. But if anyone's got any more questions as we go on, feel free to add them into the chat. I'm going to ask the presenters to turn on their cameras again, and I'll start directing questions towards them. So first question was through is around R&D. So what impact on R&D is likely to result for the ATI on the recent news of the huge hydrogen find in France? Laura,
I presume that's fund that was meant there. If I've misinterpreted that, Andrew, just let me know. So I think that's exactly why we're doing the hydrogen capability network. We need to compete with things that are happening overseas. So yes, and I'm making the assumption, so tell me if I'm wrong, you're talking about the 7 100 million euro fund announced in France over the recent months, but clearly we know the US is doing similar, the Inflation Reduction Act and the sort of 7 billion for 7 hydrogen centres is all sort of staking out the seriousness of, how other nations are reacting. And so very much what we're trying to do here is coordinate a UK response for aerospace as well, and make sure that we do the right thing as efficiently as possible as we can with the money, but make sure that the UK, sort of has a stake at that table so we can sort of underpin what the sector requires.
So yeah, some clarifications. So there were actually question was actually asking about a hydrogen find in France, and
White
I think
hydrogen,
they're alluding
right?
to yeah. So I think they're alluding to early this year being a huge deposit of white hydrogen being found in France. But I think the answer to your question doesn't really change. It's in terms of us. There's loads of activity happening across the world in terms of hydrogen developments and also finds of sort of hydrogen deposits. So it's just a case of us sort of developing our UK capability here.
Yes, I think from our perspective, we're thinking about liquefaction. We're not thinking about the upstream part of the value stream, about, whatever colour of gaseous hydrogen is produced. It's about, liquefying hydrogen to make sure we've got liquid hydrogen for R&D. I think I heard a very good thing sort of as a round table recently was, eventually at some point we'll run out of colours for the hydrogen and really should just start measuring the carbon intensity. So, how do you use the least carbon intensive hydrogen as your source, and how do we progress our journey to get to that least carbon intensive thing? And at the moment I think our journey is just what can we liquefy to make sure we've got the right amounts for R&D programs.
Excellent, thank you, Laura. I think here one for Helen. So around research topics, we showed the close link with expected low TRL EPSRC supported research. What do you see as the process to capture the dependencies?
Not sure I entirely understand the question, if I'm honest. Certainly we're looking to engage with EPSRC to see if we can to put together a proposal to look at EPSRC funding in the areas that we've highlighted as priority. If they mean dependencies in terms of capturing them within the network, we'd capture that within looking to build a research network of people, so people are already active in the area, pulling them together and building a network and a community that way. I don't know if I've answered the question there or not, if I'm honest.
Yeah, potentially. I think the question was around sort of how sort of working with those research organisations working in sort of low TRL world. So I think that's
I mean, I guess what I would say is there's another question further down about how organisations interested in training PhD level researchers engage with the ATI, the HCN. I would suggest get in touch with me would be the first point of call for that. Certainly, Simone, if you email me, that would be good. And the previous person asking the question, I can't remember the name, if they want to get in touch with me, we can start building them into the network and getting the communications out on the R&D would be what I would suggest.
Yeah, excellent. And on that point, we'll share the presentation pack, the recording of the presentation, and a way of contacting us. So if anyone does have any follow-up questions, then they're welcome to get in touch with us.
And okay, if I could just build on, I was just going to build on what Helen was saying as well. So, I mean, your recent workshop, Helen, had a number of findings of which, you're going to go through the process of disseminating and, speaking to the network about. So hopefully that will help as well. People understand some of the dependencies and how we plan to bridge that and how they can engage with us on it, including sort of the EPSRC.
Yeah, we should be communicating that out early in the new year, the outcome of that and the thinking behind the slides that you've seen presented today and why we consider those topics key. So yeah, absolutely, Laura, thank you for that. I'll add to that.
Thanks, Helen. Wasim, one for you. I think you've partially answered this in the chat, but I don't know if you just wanted to add any more comment around the demand signal and how's the demand signal of appetite, how's the demand signal or appetite of airports and airlines as end users being assessed and tracked?
Sure, yeah. So I did answer it in the chat. Maybe I should have made it a bit more clear. The demand signal is really focused on the R&D and technology development requirement. So, we do need to look at the airports and aircraft coming into service, the demand there, but those quantities are significantly more. And if we don't kind of solve this problem for this technology development in the UK and the fundamental technologies and the requirement for those, we're not going to get to that point of the airports and the aircraft in service. Also, the airports and aircraft in service are significantly large quantities compared to what we're putting together for the R&D side of things. That needs to be part of a national picture. So organizations like HCN and other organizations that are coming together and looking at cross-sector demand requirements, that's where that conversation would be happening, because the quantities are significantly more. We'll probably be looking at localized, large-scale production, significant amount of investment, and not something that the aerospace sector itself could probably justify, or should it, be involved in that solely. It's a cross-sector thing, national challenge, and I think that's where that question needs to sit, really. But it's definitely an important question and challenge that needs to be answered in the next 5 to 10 years for sure.
Absolutely.
And I think it's to emphasize on sort of why we're intervening as well. So, hopefully, so whilst I understand there might be some support for investment required for airports, hopefully that's subject to a commercial case. There's a clear return on investment for ultimately a producer to set up and supply the airports. We're very much looking at the moment, is there a need for intervention and support to make sure we've got the ability to get liquid hydrogen into the UK or made in the UK for aerospace R&D.
Thanks both. So a couple of questions here around, I guess, the location of the test hubs that we're looking at. So a question around, so if we had a test hub at Airbus, is there a risk around other organisations being able to use it and having access to liquid hydrogen? And another question around just general location. So if we were close to an airfield, that would enable flight testing in the future. So maybe a few comments from Ryan and Laura, perhaps, around the location and our thoughts on where we put the test hubs in the future.
Yeah, happy to try and answer that. They're both very good and fair questions. So I think the end game is clear. If we make the assumption that hydrogen-powered flight becomes a reality, there will need to be large-scale airport liquid hydrogen storage facilities and all the means to move it around. And we've briefly spoken about that. In the very short term, the industry doesn't really have the required health and safety confidence to do any of this testing near airports or near buildings of any note at all. And so what we found through our work so far is that we're really quite limited on where we could propose these larger these test hub locations. And you could choose any site you wanted to from a brownfield perspective. You could develop an old military base. You could go into the middle of the countryside and you could start from scratch. There are a number of organisations that are already active in doing the scale of testing we're interested in, whilst satisfying the health and safety constraints that we currently operate with. And there's all this information is available to our network, so I'll try and be as transparent as I can. There's a site up in Scotland, there's a site in Cumbria, there's a site in the Midlands, and then there's a ZEDC down in the southwest. There is no favoritism towards any of those sites. What we're trying to do is assess each of these sites against some fairly generic requirements. What's the speed to market? What's the opportunity for collaboration? How do we create and demand collaboration? I'll come back to that at the end because that was a specific question. And we conclude there's probably only 2 or 3 sites that really satisfy what the UK sector wants if we're going to protect that capability in the UK versus competition overseas. And that's why we end up with these 2 or 3 sites, the HSC one in Buxton and the ZEDC down in the southwest. Coming back to the first question, I think collaboration is probably one of the most important things. I won't go into all of the details over this webinar, but all the sites that we are now in active conversations with, the ability for them to attract government money will be predicated on the requirement that they offer access to both academia, SMEs and tier ones. So it's disruptive in a way because some of these facilities are private entities that perhaps that's not their focus, and that's really the value I hope the HCN brings in future years. that we do create that open access facility for us all to use. IP is obviously a concern, but there's already models in place and conversations ongoing on how we sort of protect IP or enable IP to be shared based on access and costs and those sort of things. I hope that's a very short answer to a very good question. If you want to follow up with me over an email, please feel free to.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ryan. So a question from a colleague who's writing a grant application for testing, modelling materials for LH2 tanks for aviation. Does ATI support this?
So I guess, Nora, to answer to that one, it's a very short statement. We can't perhaps understand some of the context. So, if it's in scope of the ATI funding programme, of which, clearly there's been an SME programme announced recently, on the ATI website itself, there's a, sort of contact the ATI or via the hub, to sign up for a tech clinic where you can exactly ask that sort of question to a technologist of, what do you think your scope is? With regards to you think there's something about the materials testing and standards that could be of interest, then have a look at the links in the chat around what the scope of the materials methods and testing program is, and there's a questionnaire. So, but I think if it is fundamentally about looking at R&D, whether that's a fit with the ATI program, then I would go sort of via the ATI contact us and via the hub.
Yeah, I've just added a link to the ATI Hub. So for anyone who's got questions specific about their projects through the ATI Hub, you're able to speak to the ATI technologists and find out a little bit more about your project being in scope or out of scope, and a bit more advice on your project. Excellent. A lot of people posting around the hydrogen find in France. I think they were providing a bit more
clarity on my question.
Content. Yes, yeah. And some great networking I see in the chat with colleagues from the CAA as well. So that's excellent to see. I know the CAA have recently launched their hydrogen challenge, and we're having discussions with them about any sort of ways of working in the future. So great to see that being shared. I think, Helen, you've answered this question about academics and researchers engaging with the ATI or HCN, which is great. So a few questions here. One around SMEs. So loads of SMEs involved in gaseous hydrogen testing, interested in cryogenic testing, but there are large barriers to entries in terms of equipment costs and other barriers to entry. Would there be investment in SMEs to develop this capability, or will funding only be funneled towards existing cryogenic facilities?
I guess I'll start, and I'll perhaps invite Ryan if he wants to contribute. So the purpose of the hubs, and I think Ryan alluded it earlier, is that they are collaborative facilities that are open access, and the reason that we're looking at making sure there's two is to make sure there is enough capacity for all users, including SMEs. We feel that there is an important signal that needs to come out from some of the big players on where and I think some of those signals are coming out on where there is greater capability, where there's supply chain gaps, I suppose, that we need it. So then there is a question of, if you need support for your R&D program, then the ATI program and the SME program that sits within the ATI is there for that. If you need test facilities for where you're going to test that product as you take it through the R&D program, then that is what the HCN is looking like. How do we have those open access facilities and the support around that infrastructure for when you want to go and test with liquid hydrogen? Ryan, I don't know if you want to add.
No, I think that's fair. I think I'd only add, I think one of the elephants in the room, but we've learned it very clearly, is that even small scale liquid hydrogen testing in academic sort of environments is simply not possible in academia. When people start looking at the health and safety requirements, it becomes untenable. So that feeds this requirement, as Laura says, to really make sure these hubs are fit for purpose. If we don't build something, we can't do it in the UK. And if we build something, then we enter into these challenges about what it looks like and how we get access into it. But the fundamental core takeaway is we don't have anything to do this testing today. And we need to build something to try and enable these conversations with academia, with SMEs, with everyone. You might be hearing a lot of sort of top-down tier 1 driven requirements. I think it's important to stress that this is not the focus of what we've been doing in the last 6 months. It's really engaging with academia, the SMEs, and everyone to try and understand what they need to enable their ambition in this space for the next 10 years.
Completely agree. Thank you both. Question here around, I'm not too sure if I understand the question, but getting a document with the specific requirements / guidelines for LH2 testing sites, if it's possible to get access to a document like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the HSC, they've been very supportive. Just when we start talking about, forget facilities for a second, the actual health and safety requirements of what you need to do to consider when you approach anyone to build a liquid hydrogen or cryogenic testing facility, they have some guidance which they are looking to issue in Q1 next year. So that will be made publicly available. They're a government agency. From an HCN perspective, we've certainly got some thoughts that we can distribute in future comms as and when you see fit.
Excellent. So I think we've covered most of the questions here in the chat. Yeah, a few more people adding contact details, which is great. I know we've had a discussion, the team has had a discussion with Tim from University of Bath, so thanks for adding your contact details there. Maybe a last question from me just to sort of round off the webinar. So we presented a lot of interventions there. What are our priorities for the HCN, and what are our immediate next steps over the next 6 months or so?
Okay, so I think clearly from my perspective within sort of the HCN is, we are currently funded to the end of March. We feel, and what we need to make sure is that from across the sector, from people hearing this webinar, that we have addressed some of the interventions for aerospace that are priorities. So what is our priority? It's to try and secure some funding for these interventions to start as soon as possible on the priority activities as of April next year. We, for everyone to be aware, as we have quarterly reviews with DBT, or formal quarterly reviews with DBT, but sort of regular engagements, they are hearing what we're saying on the priorities of the interventions, and they are, also hearing the messages back from the sector, hopefully on the value of what the Hydrogen Capability Network is coordinating. So, that is our priority at the moment, is how do we get the right seed funding to the right activities so we can start acting and positioning what the UK needs. And, Ryan said it very nicely, in answer to the question on SMEs, we need those facilities. So we need to start putting in place the building blocks that are going to make these things happen.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Laura. I think it's been great, and thank you to everyone for asking really good questions throughout the webinar and throughout the chat. As I mentioned, we'll be sharing the presentation slides and a recording of the presentation shortly, so keep an eye on your mailboxes for that. And if you do have any further questions that come up, we'll be sharing our contact details as well, so feel free to drop us an email with any questions or comments, or if you've got any projects that you're working on that you think might be useful or appropriate, then please do reach out. In the meantime, thank you very much again. I don't know if it's too early to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, but I'm going to do it anyway. Thanks again for joining, and we'll close the webinar there. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.